told you that you can change the life of a person that will be born 50 years from now. I had the same curious reaction as you probably did when I first heard this question. Ever since I was 14 years old, my older brother has put upon me the responsibility to kind of take care of my younger siblings and cousins' education, more in the sense of political conscience and self-development, things that they should be learning at school, but they just don't teach you at school in Angola for obvious political reasons. Unlike many other young people in Angola, my older brother has always been this guy who enjoyed reading books and watching documentaries. And he was passionate about social change, despite living in a country where people often told him not to try to be some kind of change maker, because it was something that only happened in movies, apparently. But still, he kept sharing his revolutionary ideas among family gatherings and friends groups and among college peers. And one day, he decided that he should share the same ideas with me, his 14-year-old younger sister. Back then, I didn't quite understand what he was trying to do. But looking back at it today, I understand that it was an act of generational responsibility. So he started sharing his political views with me, and I started understanding more and more what he wanted to do. My older brother was a big inspiration for me, and he was always this revolutionary person. He's been acting towards generational responsibility ever since. As I grew up, I started to understand my older brother's actions more and more deeply, and I've come to the understanding that our lifestyle today is pretty much the result of decisions made in the past. I only started to understand the statement very clearly when I looked at the three most recent generations in my country. And I made this evaluation in order to see what is the historical role that each generation had and what is the impact they had on each other. So let's look at analysis in the form of a pyramid. In the base of this pyramid, we have the first generation, which is my grandparents' generation. This is the one who fought for independence 47 years ago. And this is a generation that is considered heroic in a sense. It's the one that we learn about in the history books in 5th grade. I grew up hearing this very extraordinary but at the same time sad stories from my grandpa about the fight for independence. But he always transmitted to me how important he felt for being part of such a big cause and being part of the group of people who were responsible for bringing liberation to the country. However, after the fight for our autonomy, there wasn't an agreement on which type of country we wanted to be. And the different political ideologies generated a civil war and divided the country in two sides. And there was no worse time for this to happen when the whole world was already polarized by the Cold War. This takes us to the second generation in this pyramid. And this is the generation who had to go through the civil war. This one is represented by millions of people, including my own parents, who had to start over their lives in different parts of the country, or even outside of the country, because all of they known was destroyed by this conflict. In this short timeline between the fight for independence and the Civil War, there wasn't really a space for us to build ourselves as an independent country. And this is why I still believe that till this day, there is some kind of disappointment from my parents' generation towards my grandparents' generation. Because maybe they still felt like something more could have been done for the country. The social and the economic inequalities we wanted to eradicate after independence persisted. And in the end, this new state of Angola wasn't that different than the colonial one. And whenever there are social inequalities, there are also voices emerging wanting social change. And in an attempt to challenge the power structures, May 27 happened. This is still, till this day, one of the most taboo subjects to talk about in Angola. It was a time when young people wanted change in the power structures, but ended up lynched and tortured in the streets. This is still this day one of the greatest examples of structural violence that we have in the country. and it resulted in the silencing of the political discussions in the country among the different social groups. But despite events like this one, if it wasn't for the resilience of this generation, my generation wouldn't be called the generation of peace. And certainly, I wouldn't be able to stand here today talking to you about these subjects freely. But still, despite this generation's resistance, they still carried and carry till this day a lot of trauma and history, which leads my generation to be the one absorbing this trauma and history too. I was raised by elders constantly telling me things like, you need to learn how to dance to the system's music, which literally means you need to learn how to follow the rules of power. Ironically, because these same elders were the ones who were created in an educational-based revolutionary state that allowed them to be protagonists of events such as the first time I went to a peaceful protest, my mom told me not to go to. And still I went. I had to be careful with police brutality. I, just like many other young people in Angola that you talk to, grew up hearing this very famous sentence in our culture and art that goes by, "Che menino não fala política," which means, kid, do not talk about politics. This phrase was by the second generation. And the same mindset that my mom has is the same mindset of millions of people in Angola who were taught to avoid social change, not because they understand social change is a bad thing in the first place, but because they learned to fear the consequences that the power structures could impose upon them. My generation is called the generation of peace. But at the same time, we start questioning this peace. And we start to understand that peace is more than just the absence of war. Peace is quality of life. Peace is justice, and peace is equity. The questions that we start making about this supposed social stability that we have generated several protests in the country since 2015, which was the year when the country was shaken by the 15+2, the first ever wave of anti-government protests ever since our civil war. This event was, from my point of view, a big change in the social paradigm of how we saw activism in the country. An event such as this brought a more critical but also practical way of approaching social problems. This phrase from one of my favorite Angolan artists called Sef Kappa goes by, "With how many arms can a country be built, and in how many phases it is composed from its root?" This sentence basically summarizes the concerns that the young people in Angola have been having in the last 7 years. Since 2015, social activism has also grown in the country. And even a few recreated new currents of activism that approach different topics in their agendas. But what do these three generations have in common in the first place? These generations share a legacy of social transformations in their respective times. Transformations that were only possible because there were individuals who were politically aware of their generational responsibility. The American law writer Edith Brown Weiss defines generational responsibility as each human generation receives from the previous one the natural and cultural environment with the right of usufruct and the duty to conserve it in the same conditions for the next generation. However, imagine with me a social context of the country that in the last 50 years has only donated 2.4% of their annual budget towards education. With these numbers, it is easier to view a society that is unable to conserve its natural and cultural environment due to the structural devaluation of education. And despite the legacy of revolutionary changes that the two previous generations from mine left, this generation still failed to leave us an educational project. In the process of preparing this talk, I decided to define my generation as a generation with no excuse. Because from the three generations in this analysis, we are certainly the one who has the most tools to perform structural changes. But to this day, we still have to deal with the consequences and the collateral damages of decisions made by the previous generations. Different than the majority of the people in Angola, I was privileged for having a brother who awakened in me the necessity of understanding my socio-political role in my community. And this is exactly why I believe that we need to make more people aware of the responsibilities that our generation has. But we are still very few people in this fight. And knowing that the changes that we want to make are still going to take a long time, we look for alternative means in order to educate and share information for more people, so that we can go from few to many in this fight. The internet, for example, has become